Hello and welcome to our third video in this series. And in this series what we've been doing is exploring what C.S. Lewis meant by the phrase true myth. Now it is necessary to do this to understand and appreciate his unique approach after becoming a Christian to both sharing and defending the gospel, especially defending the gospel. And we will see that in more detail in our last part of this series. But what we have a few more things to explore regarding is in his conversion and in his relation to this whole question of myth and gospel. As we considered in our last video, Lewis's conversion to Christianity was a slow process in which he gradually awakened to the truth of who Christ was, not a sudden emotional moment. This makes it difficult to pinpoint when Lewis actually converted to Christ, but there are hints in his writings subsequent to the last statement that he made in his October 18 letter to Arthur Greeves, when he said that he was nearly certain that it really happened. Our question is, when might we be able to say that he had clearly transitioned and that he was in fact finally certain that it really happened? Well, we see hints in his subsequent letters that his full conversion most likely occurred sometime between mid-October and Christmas of 1931. And here are some of those hints. In a letter dated October 24 of that year, 1931, he explains to his older brother, Warnie Lewis, that he had recently read a book on Christian apologetics that made him say of Christianity, "Here is the very thing you like in poetry and the romances." By the way, that's what he would call myths. And then he says, only this time, it's true. In the same letter, he describes pagan mythology specifically as vague ideas of something we want but haven't got, which are nothing more than the first and most rudimentary forms of the idea of God. And in that same letter, he also describes in some detail what he had been learning at the church services that he was now apparently attending more regularly. Then, in a subsequent letter to that, on November 8th, Lewis was writing to Greeves again, Arthur Greeves, and he spoke of pagan stories as mere beginnings, the first faint whisper of the wind from beyond the world, while Christianity is the thing itself. The thing itself. Now, it would seem, based on his calling Christianity the thing itself, implying that all the pagan stories were merely seen now as hinting at, that Lewis's mind was finally made up. Christ's story, the incarnation, crucifixion, and resurrection, really did happen. And he had finally believed what Tolkien and Dyson had told him on that mid-September evening in 1931. And that is this, that God's myth, the gospel, was the true myth because it had indeed really happened. And God had come into history to sacrifice himself to redeem the human race. Now, some more hints were that by December 6th of that year, writing again to Arthur Greeves, Lewis reflects on the atonement and whether the Gospels really teach what the rest of the New Testament does about it. I'll say more about that in a moment. But he also paraphrases 1 Peter 3:15 in a way that indicates the importance of giving, quote, a reason for your faith, end quote, and that this reason should be grounded in the Bible itself. He states that a historical and theological understanding will help one see that the Bible is, ready for this, more than superstition. By this time, then, it is clear that Lewis had high esteem for the Bible and the need to give a reason for the faith. Such concerns would be rather meaningless, it would seem, to an unbeliever. He also refers to paganism as the next best thing to Christianity, implying that Christianity is superior to paganism and its myths. All things someone outside of Christianity would probably not find much interest in or be concerned about. Another clue is that on Christmas Day, 1931, he wrote again to his brother, Warnie, and he speaks of attending an early morning church service and what he had learned from the morning sermon. Significantly, it was, ready for this, a communion service. And Warney knew that his little brother would not take that lightly, but that was a really serious thing to be part of a communion service. It's something that he had not done since his childhood, when he had considered himself an atheist. And that was around age 14. He also spoke of the second coming in this letter as something that he now took seriously. It's worth noting that his own brother took note of the younger Lewis's conversion in a memoir that he wrote, saying, I well remember that day. A specific day is not given, of course, but he says, I well remember that day in 1931 when we made a visit to Whipsnade Zoo, Jack riding in my sidecar, as recorded in Surprised by Joy. And it was during that outing that he made his decision. That's what his older brother said about his conversion. Lewis states further that the conversion was, and by Lewis, this time I mean Warney Lewis, the older Lewis. He states further that the conversion was no sudden plunge into new life, but rather a slow, steady convalescence from a deep-seated spiritual illness. So Warney's account collaborates with the younger Lewis, although he does not provide exactly, as we said earlier, what day or time of year it was in 1931. He wrote to Greaves on January 10th. This is C.S. Lewis. He wrote to Greaves the following year, January 10th, and resumes his discussion defending the idea that the atonement had to have been taught by Christ in the Gospels, since it is found immediately after his death in the apostles' writing the epistles. This seems to be the first indication of Lewis defending Christian doctrine, and such detailed defense would only be the interest of a Christian. It also indicates that Lewis believed in the atonement of Christ. He concludes this letter to Greaves with this remarkable statement, and this is a big one. If you take out the sacrificial idea out of Christianity, then you deprive both Judaism and paganism of all significance. Can one believe that there was just nothing in that persistent motif of blood, death, and resurrection, which runs like a black and scarlet cord through all the greater myths, through Balder and Dionysus and Adonis? Surely the history of the human mind hangs together better if you suppose that all this was the first shadowy approach of something whose reality came with Christ. So it seems that somewhere between October 18th and Christmas of 1931, Lewis had gotten over his last barrier. He accepted that Christ died for his redemption. And thanks to the various factors converging in his life, not least of which was the influence of his Christian friends, Hugo Dyson and J.R.R. Tolkien, he had become a full convert to Christianity. Christianity and the gospel of Christ then became a growingly important part of Lewis's life, as is evident in his letters to his brother and his friend Arthur Greaves, as well as other people who were just writing to him. He had a lot to say about the gospel and Christianity. But we don't find it just in his letters, but in his writings. His first clearly Christian work after his conversion was about his own spiritual journey to Christ in a little-known book entitled The Pilgrim's Regress that was completed in 1933. It is significant, too, that he subtitled this book, in part, An Allegorical Apology for Christianity, thus setting the stage for his passion to defend the truth of Christianity to the unbelieving world. As concerning myth, Lewis clearly had a great love for it, and it never diminished. He came to see it as a divine prelude among the pagans to Christ's incarnation, crucifixion, and resurrection, just as the messianic prophecies did for the Jews. We'll unpack that further in our next episode and see just how Lewis used myth in his apologetic for Christianity to his own generation. And, I believe, provided some very valuable insights into how we can use it in ours. If you like our videos, we want you to like them, subscribe, and ring that bell so that you can receive notifications when we upload some more.